The moment I understood what my son had done, the ocean didn't feel cold anymore. It felt indifferent, like it had been waiting for me without knowing my name, and now that I'd arrived, it simply didn't care whether I stayed or left. I was 14 miles offshore on a disabled boat with a tropical storm pushing up from the south, and Connor was already gone. My name is Edward Morrison. People call me Ed. I'm 66 years old, a retired Navy veteran from Brunswick, Georgia, and I spent 28 years on the water before I came home to grow old quietly. I never imagined the water would be where my own son tried to kill me. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. It always does. My wife Carol passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and brutal, and utterly without mercy. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I held her hand on a Tuesday morning in October, and by the following Thursday she was gone, and the house we'd built together over 34 years became a place I walked through without touching anything. Connor was our only child. He was 32 when Carol died and already in trouble, though I didn't know the full shape of it then. He'd always been restless, the kind of man who chased the feeling of almost having something rather than the thing itself. He'd tried real estate, cryptocurrency, a sports bar that lasted 8 months. Carol used to say he was still becoming himself. She said it like it was a comfort. After she died, I tried to say it too. It didn't sound the same coming from me. 6 months after the funeral, Connor started calling more. Texting, stopping by, asking questions about the house and what I planned to do with it. Asking about my retirement accounts in the roundabout way people do when they're working up to something. I thought grief had softened him. I thought losing his mother had finally cracked open the better version of him that Carol always believed existed. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. And hope is the last thing a father gives up on his child. The money requests started small. $10,000 for a business opportunity he couldn't explain without making me nervous. $15,000 for a debt he said was a misunderstanding. Then $30,000, and he stopped calling it a loan. I gave it to him because he was my son and Carol was gone, and what else was I going to do with retirement savings in an empty house? I gave it to him, and I told myself it was what Carol would have wanted. I told myself that for almost 2 years. Last spring I found out the truth. Not from Connor. From a man named Ray Tillman who knocked on my door one evening holding Connor's name on a piece of paper. He was polite about it, business casual, almost apologetic. He said Connor owed his employer a significant sum from a private card game that had been running for 3 years in a warehouse outside Savannah. He said significant meant $340,000. He said if I was Connor's father, and he believed I was, I might want to have a conversation with my son about timelines. I called Connor that night. He didn't deny it. He sounded tired, like a man who'd been carrying something too heavy for too long. "Dad, I'm handling it," he said. "You can't handle this," I said. "Connor, this isn't a business loss. These people will hurt you." "I know," he said. "I know." There was a silence on the line, and then he said, "I don't know what to do, Dad." And for the first time in a long time, he sounded like the boy I remembered, the one who used to come to me when things broke, and he needed help fixing them. I told him to come over. We sat at the kitchen table until midnight. I gave him $50,000 from the last of Carol's life insurance disbursement. I told him it was the last time. He hugged me before he left, and I stood in the doorway watching his taillights disappear, and I told myself we'd turned a corner. 3 months later, he called again. Different tone, warm in a way that felt practiced. "Dad, I've been thinking. You always talked about doing a real offshore trip, remember? Deep water fishing. Out past the shelf where the big marlins run. I've been in touch with a guy who charters out of Street Simon's Island. Let me take you. Early birthday present. No phones. No distractions. Just us." I should have known. Connor had never been comfortable on open water. He got seasick on a ferry once. He'd refused every fishing trip I'd suggested for 20 years. But I wanted to believe the corner was real. I wanted to believe my son was becoming the man his mother had always seen in him. So I said yes. We left the marina at Street Simon's on a Saturday morning in August. Connor had rented a 2.8 Foot offshore, center console. Well kept. Fully equipped. He'd bought food and drinks, packed light gear, handled every detail himself. I noticed he'd paid cash at the fuel dock. I noticed he hadn't brought a phone. I thought it was him honoring the spirit of the trip. I thought it was growth. We ran southeast for 2 hours. The Georgia coast flattened behind us, and the water went from brown to green to the deep blue-black of the Gulf Stream. It was genuinely beautiful. Connor seemed relaxed. We talked about Carol for a while, the kind of easy talking about her that had taken 3 years to feel possible. We ate the sandwiches he'd brought around noon. He'd made mine himself. Turkey on wheat, no mustard. The way Carol always knew I liked it. I thought, this is real. This is my son. I fell asleep in the fighting chair around 1 in the afternoon. I don't normally sleep on the water. I've been on the water my whole adult life, and I've always stayed sharp at sea. But I was warm and full and the hum of the engine was steady and I just drifted off. I didn't know until much later that what I thought was exhaustion was something else. Something Connor had added to my coffee that morning. I woke up and the engine was silent. The sun had moved. It was mid-afternoon by the angle of the light, which meant I'd been out for nearly 3 hours. The boat was drifting, engine off, no sound except the water against the hull. I sat up and my head was thick. My vision slightly doubled in a way that took a moment to clear. Connor was gone. I called his name twice. Check the head. Check below deck. The small, inflatable tender we'd towed behind us was gone. His bag was gone. The boat's radio handset had been removed from its mount, cleanly, recently. I could see the connector port where it had been seated. I went to the helm. The ignition keys were gone. I tried the backup switch. Nothing. I went forward and lifted the engine hatch and understood immediately what I was looking at. Someone who knew engines had removed a critical section of the fuel line and taken it with them. Not someone. My son. My hands were steadier than I expected. Maybe because Navy training doesn't rust the way civilian instincts do. When things go wrong at sea, you don't start with the worst thought. You start with inventory. I made myself slow down. I made myself breathe. I walked every inch of that boat with the methodical attention of a man who once ran damage control drills for a living. No radio. No keys. No functional engine. No flares. He'd taken the flares too. The whole kit from the starboard storage box. The life vests were still there, which told me something about how he'd thought through this. It needed to look like an accident. A man overboard scenario. An old vet who'd gone offshore alone, which was maybe how Connor had described this trip to anyone who asked, and had simply disappeared. I sat with that thought for a moment and let it settle. Then I kept looking. Under the port gunwale, bolted to the fiberglass in a bracket so old the paint had grown over half the hardware. I found it. An EPIRB. Emergency position indicating radio beacon. Required by maritime law on any vessel operating beyond 3 miles offshore. Most boat owners forget they have one. Most boat renters never know it's there. Connor had removed the VHF radio, removed the flares, taken the handset. He'd been thorough, but he hadn't checked the hull for legacy emergency equipment that had probably been mounted to that bracket before he was born. I worked it free of the bracket, checked the battery indicator, green light. Strong charge. I activated it. An EPIRB doesn't speak. You don't hear a voice on the other end. You activate it and then you wait. And you trust the system you spent your career believing in. The signal transmits to satellite and the satellite transmits to the Coast Guard and the Coast Guard begins triangulating your position. It's not fast, but it works. I sat down in the fighting chair and looked south. The sky had changed while I was sleeping. The horizon was the wrong color. A yellow-green that I recognized from 30 years of reading weather at sea. The tropical depression that had been sitting 200 miles off the Florida coast when we left that morning had moved faster than forecast. I could feel it in the way the swells were starting to organize, long and low and coming from the south with a purpose they hadn't had that morning. Connor had planned for this too. He'd known the storm was tracking north. He'd known that by the time anyone realized I was missing, The weather window for searching would be closed. He'd counted on the storm finishing what the disabled engine started. 14 miles offshore in August with a tropical storm incoming and no way to call for help. An old man. Alone. He'd even planned the narrative. The worried son who'd let his stubborn father go out despite his protests. The tragic accident. The body that might never be recovered, or if it was, would show nothing inconsistent with a drowning. I thought about the life insurance policy. I'd taken it out when Connor was young, in the years when I was deploying and Carol had asked me to make sure they'd be taken care of. $2 million. I'd never updated the beneficiary after Connor turned 30 because it never occurred to me that I needed to. Because it never occurred to me that I was something to be liquidated. That thought, specifically that word in my mind, liquidated, was the one that made me angry. Not scared. Not heartbroken. Angry in the cold, controlled way that I'd learned to be angry at sea. Where anger that goes hot gets men killed. I went back to the helm and started thinking about the storm. A boat drifting without power in open ocean during a tropical storm has better odds than most people think if the operator knows what they're doing. The primary rule is to stay with the vessel. A 8-foot center console in moderate seas is survivable. A swimmer in the same seas is not. I went through the remaining supplies. A small cooler with water and fruit that Connor hadn't bothered removing. A first aid kit. 2 life vests and a throw ring. A dive knife in a sheath, zip-tied under the console that I found by accident when I was checking connections. I used that time, the 2 hours before the storm hit, to prepare the boat as well as I could. I ran a line from bow to stern on the low side as a handhold. I tied off everything loose. I put on a life vest and cinched it properly. I drank water steadily and ate 2 apples because core temperature and blood sugar matter in prolonged exposure situations, and I knew from experience that the time to start managing them is before you need to, not after. When the storm hit, it hit hard. I won't pretend those 12 hours were manageable. They weren't. The swells ran 8 to 10 feet by midnight. The rain came in horizontal sheets that stung like thrown gravel. I was on my knees on the deck more than I was on my feet, braced against the gunwale, keeping the vessel oriented as best I could without power, riding the swells rather than fighting them. Twice I lost my grip and slid, and the line I'd strung saved me both times. I thought about Carol. Not in a dramatic way, just the ordinary way you think about people who are gone, what she would say about this. Probably something that would make me laugh, and that's what I needed, so I let myself hear her voice in my head for a few minutes, and then I went back to focusing on the water. The EPIRB kept transmitting. I had to trust it. I had nothing else. The Coast Guard cutter found me at 7:40 in the morning. The storm had moved north by then and left behind a gray, flat sea and a silence that felt earned. I heard the engines before I saw the vessel, and when I stood up and waved, there were 2 crew members on the bow already pointing at me, and I am not ashamed to tell you that I sat down immediately after and put my face in my hands for about 15 seconds. Just 15. Then I straightened up and waited for them to come alongside. The petty officer who helped me aboard was maybe 25 years old. He looked at me the way young people look at old people who've done something inexplicable. "Sir, were you anchored out here alone?" "No," I said. "My son brought me out. He had to leave." The petty officer looked at the missing radio mount, at the empty flare kit bracket. He didn't say anything else, but I watched his eyes settle into something that wasn't confusion anymore. They took me to the Coast Guard station at Brunswick, treated for mild dehydration and exposure. A doctor looked me over and said I was in remarkable shape for the night I'd had. I told her I'd had worse. She didn't believe me, but she was polite about it. A Coast Guard investigator named Lieutenant Paulson came in while the doctor was finishing up. He had a notepad and the careful face of someone who asks questions for a living. I told him everything. The EPIRB, the removed equipment, the missing fuel line section, the inflatable tender. My son's name. He listened without expression, and then said, "Mr. Morrison, your son filed a missing person report with Glynn County Sheriff's Office at approximately 8 p.m. last night. He stated that you'd insisted on taking the boat out alone yesterday morning, and he'd tried to talk you out of it. I looked at Paulson for a moment. He got ahead of it this time, I said. He planned for that too. Paulson put down his pen. He said, I'll be honest with you. What you're describing is serious. But the physical evidence on that vessel is going to be important. We need to document it properly before anyone touches it. Can I ask you to do something difficult? What's that? Don't contact your son yet. Let us bring him in for a welfare check first. See what story he gives before he knows you're alive. I thought about it for about 4 seconds. That's long enough. Sure, I said. They kept me at the station for the rest of the day. Paulson's team went back out to the boat and documented everything. The missing radio mount, the deliberately removed fuel line segment, which they found tucked under the port storage box, apparently dropped rather than taken when Connor left in a hurry. The empty flare kit, the EPIRB still transmitting in its bracket. Paulson came back in the afternoon with photographs and a very quiet expression. He told the story himself without needing my help, Paulson said, looking at the photos spread on the table between us. A fuel line doesn't remove itself. A radio handset doesn't walk off its mount. He said Connor had given a statement to the sheriff's office the previous evening, said I'd been drinking at the marina, that I'd insisted on taking the boat alone, that he'd argued with me on the dock, said he'd watched me motor away and had stood there for 20 minutes hoping I'd come back. Very detailed statement, very prepared. That's when I asked about the wire. I want to hear him say it, I told Paulson. I want him on record saying what he did and why. Not for the law. The law will do what the law does. I want to hear him say it to my face so I know he understood what he was doing, so he can't spend the rest of his life telling himself it wasn't what it was. Paulson looked at me for a long moment, then he said, I can help you with that. They put me in Brunswick Regional Medical Center the next morning. My idea. Paulson's team had worked out the logistics overnight. I was in a hospital bed, IV in my arm, monitors attached. The legitimate equipment of a man who'd spent a night at sea in a tropical storm. Because that's exactly what I was. The hypothermia protocol was real. The dehydration treatment was real. The rest was theater. Connor arrived at the hospital at 2 inches the afternoon. I heard his voice in the hallway before I saw him, talking to a nurse, asking which room, the concerned son performing right up to the door. When he walked in, his eyes were red. His face was arranged in grief. He was very good at it. I'd given him too little credit for that. Dad. He came to the bedside and took my hand. His hands were cold. Oh, thank God. I was so scared. I kept calling the Coast Guard all night. They said they had a signal, but couldn't confirm. I waited until his voice wound down. Then I said, I found the fuel line, Connor. His hand tightened on mine briefly, and then went very still. I had time to look for it, I said. 14 hours is a long time. I found where you put it, and I found the radio mount, and I found the empty flare kit. I activated the EPIRB. I want you to know I never panicked, not once. Do you know why? He didn't answer. His face had gone the color of old paper. Because I knew what you'd done, I said. I understood the plan. And I decided I wasn't going to let it work. So I want you to tell me why. Not the debts. I know about the debts. Tell me why this, instead of asking me. Connor looked at the door. It was closed. There was a security guard visible through the narrow window who was not a security guard. There was a woman outside in the parking lot with a phone who was not a visitor. He didn't know that. He looked back at me. And then something shifted in his face. The performance fell away in pieces. And what was underneath was exhausted and ashamed and not the man I'd watched grow up, but something that had grown alongside him and finally taken over. Because you would have said no, he said. His voice was flat. You would have given me a lecture about self-reliance and told me I needed to face this myself. You've been saying no for 2 years. I gave you $100,000 over 2 years. It wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. And I couldn't keep asking. I couldn't stand the look on your face when I asked. Like I was something broken you didn't know how to fix. You were something I loved. I said. That's all. He shook his head. The insurance policy. I kept thinking about it. $2 million. You don't need it. You're alone. Mom's gone. The house is just a house. And I thought, if it looked like an accident at sea, there'd be no question. He paused. I've been thinking about it for 8 months. I didn't decide until last week. 8 months, I said. He rubbed his face. You survived the night, he said. I didn't think you would. I thought the storm would. He stopped. You thought the storm would finish it, I said. He nodded. I looked at my son. I looked at the person Carol and I had made. The person we'd raised and sacrificed for and believed in past the point that belief was reasonable, and I felt something that wasn't grief and wasn't rage, but existed in the space between them where very cold, very old emotions live. Connor, I said. The door is going to open in about 15 seconds. He looked at me confused. And then the door opened, and Lieutenant Paulson and 2 Glynn County detectives walked in, and Connor turned toward them with the expression of a man who understands very suddenly what he walked into. Connor Morrison, one of the detectives said. He recited the words. Connor didn't fight it. He stood very still while they cuffed him. As they walked him toward the door, he stopped and turned back once, and I don't know what he was looking for in my face. I know what I gave him. I gave him the truth. I gave him nothing I didn't mean. I'm sorry too, I said. I'm sorry I couldn't figure out how to help you before it came to this. They took him out. The door closed. I lay back against the pillow. The monitors beeped. Outside the window, Brunswick was doing what Georgia coast cities do in August, hot and green and going about its business. I thought about Carol. I thought about the house that was just a house now, and the boy who'd grown into a man who'd looked at his father's life and seen an obstacle. 4 months later, I sat in a Glynn County courtroom and watched Connor enter a plea of guilty to charges of attempted murder, tampering with safety equipment on a vessel, and filing a false report with law enforcement. His attorney had negotiated hard. The prosecution had been harder. Paulson testified about the fuel line and the removed equipment. The EPIRB technician testified about the activation timestamp. The Coast Guard toxicologist testified about what they'd found in the residue testing on the coffee thermos. I'd thought to bring aboard the cutter with me, a fact that Paulson told me later was the most important single piece of evidence in the case. The substance was a sedative available by prescription, traceable, and Connor's medical records showed a prescription filled 3 weeks before our trip. Connor sat at the defense table in a suit I didn't recognize and watched all of it without expression. I watched him watch it. I tried to find in his face the small versions of him, the kid who used to sit on the dock with me and ask how big the fish got, the one who cried at the end of every sad movie and pretended he had something in his eye. I couldn't stop looking for him. I don't think I'll ever stop. The judge sentenced him to 22 years. Possibility of parole in 14. After sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse into the August heat and stood on the steps, and Lieutenant Paulson came out and stood next to me, and we didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "How are you doing?" "I don't know yet," I said. "That's the right answer," he said. He told me what I already knew. That the house would sell well in the current market if I decided to move on. That the life insurance policy could be restructured with a charity beneficiary, something Carol would have liked. That there were people who ran offshore survival training programs who were always looking for Navy veterans with real experience. That there were options I probably hadn't considered because I'd been too busy surviving to think about living. I thought about that word a lot in the weeks that followed. Surviving versus living. They're not the same thing. I'd been surviving for 4 years. Since Carol. Since the house became a place I walked through. Since I started measuring my days by absence rather than presence. I'm in Savannah now. Different city, not far, but different enough. I have a small place near the water because I've never been able to stay away from the water, and I'm old enough to stop pretending I should. I work 2 days a week with a maritime safety nonprofit, teaching offshore emergency procedures to recreational boaters. They put me with a group of teenagers last month, and I showed them how an EPIRB works, what to do when an engine fails, how to read the sky when the weather is lying to you. One of them asked me how I knew all this stuff. I told them I learned some of it in the Navy, and the rest of it the hard way. I wrote Connor a letter 6 weeks after the sentencing. I told him what I'd told the court in my victim statement. That I loved him. That I had loved him imperfectly. Probably in the ways that fathers love sons when they don't know how to cross the distance that opens between them. That I didn't understand what had grown in him over those years, and maybe I never would. That I hoped the time ahead of him would become something other than punishment. That his mother would have wanted me to say all of this, and I was saying it because she was right about most things. He hasn't written back. Maybe he will. Maybe he won't. I checked the mailbox, and I don't hold my breath. There's a woman named Rita who coordinates the volunteer program at the nonprofit. She's 61, sharp, lost her husband to a stroke 2 years ago. She brings good coffee to the morning briefings, and she asks good questions about the curriculum. And last week she laughed at something I said in a way that Carol used to laugh, completely unguarded, not caring how it sounded. I told her an old Navy joke that had no business being that funny, and she laughed like that. And I stood there in the morning light thinking that grief is not a door that closes, and joy is not a door that opens. And people who've lived long enough know that both of them are always slightly ajar at the same time. I still go offshore. I went last month, out past the shelf where the water goes dark. I took a rental boat, and I checked every piece of safety equipment myself personally before I cast off. I ran the engine checks twice. I verified the EPIRB. I filed a float plan with the marina. I was out there for 6 hours. The big swells running long and even. The horizon clean in every direction. No one else. For miles. It was the best day I've had in a long time. Here is what I want you to take from this, if you've stayed with me this far. The ocean doesn't hold grudges. It'll try to kill you. And then turn beautiful in the same hour. Without any contradiction. Human beings are more complicated than water. We hold everything we've ever felt in the same body, and we carry it forward. And sometimes the weight tips us over, and sometimes it doesn't, and the difference isn't always about strength. My son was not strong enough. He told me that himself, in the hospital room, in the moment before the door opened. I've turned that sentence over many times since. I used to hear it as an accusation, a final verdict on my failures as a father. Now, I hear it differently. I hear a person who found the wrong answer to a real problem. The problem was real. The debt was real. The fear was real. The answer was wrong. Those things can both be true, and I am done pretending they can't. I checked the EPIRB on my bathroom shelf this morning. Green light. Always check your equipment. Always know where the emergency signal is before you need it. And if you find yourself alone and disabled and drifting in the dark with a storm coming and a son who's already gone, remember this. You've survived every bad day you've ever had. I know because I counted mine. I had enough to lose count. And then I activated the beacon. And I held on. And I waited for the light.